happened in the early 2000s, where we went from a greening model to something totally different. And that is, we stopped worrying about bottom line, and companies like this started focusing on top line. We even saw it with Walmart and their whole sustainability index initiative that they're putting forward. It really is about making the supply chain transparent. It is fundamentally, as Mike Duke, the CEO, stated just last year, he said the index will bring about a more transparent supply chain, drive product innovation, and ultimately provide consumers the information they need to assess the sustainability of products. If we work together, we can create a new retail standard for the 21st century. So this isn't just niceness on the part of Walmart. They're not really just thinking about social issues. This is all about competitive advantage. Whether it's GE, whether it's Walmart, whether it's any other companies out there, they realize that it's not just about greening, it's about competitive advantage. It's about distinguishing yourself from others in the marketplace. It's about selling them the planet, all right? It's a big deal. So the early 2000s really introduced the fourth age of pollution control, which is the age of sustainability. The age of sustainability is totally different. Adam Werbach really defined this in one of his talks. He was the youngest president of the Sierra Club, and he defined it in this: the birth of blue, or more fully, the death of green and the birth of blue, which sent shockwaves through the environmentalist community, because they had so long survived on the notion that, you know, being green was hard and you had to give up toilet paper and you had to walk to work and all the stuff normal people don't do. And Adam Werbach basically said, no, let's kill this notion and go with blue. And blue is an aspirational model. It's not about foregoing things. It's about aspiring to better things. And business isn't the enemy. Business is a cooperative partner in everything that we do. And he outlined this in his Strategy for Sustainability, a business manifesto published by Harvard Business Press. And what he did was outline this notion of how businesses can actually make sustainability part of their core business as opposed to just a side compliance issue. Very, very powerful. So greening was just about improving efficiency. It was about reducing the amount of pollution, making production more efficient so less pollution was actually emitted into the atmosphere. But sustainability is all about the top line. And that's what businesses ultimately care about, is the top line. So when we look at the ages across this map, here we see the road to sustainable enterprise. This was a paper written by Stuart Hart and Mark Milstein, the case for GE's Ecomagination initiative. And what they do is put this into the grand context of 50 years of pollution control in the US. And if you notice here, 1945 to the 1960s was really the pollution denial era. That is the age of denial, where, you know what? Pollution was inevitable. It was the smell of money. If your rivers didn't flow, that was the sign of prosperity. If you couldn't see the very smokestacks that were putting dollars in your wallet, that was the symbol of prosperity. And that you had to pollute if you wanted to prosper. Period. End of story. But then we got into the age of obligation. Really, it was the end of pipe regulations that we saw, where the polluter pays. You pay to reduce your negative impact to the environment. And it's a very expensive model, but very effective. Then we saw the greening movement in the 1980s. Again, pollution prevention, product stewardship, eco-efficiency. Those were all important things, but it was just one evolutionary step where we got to the sustainability movement, which we're in the midst of now, hasn't quite shaken out, but businesses are getting the notion of clean technologies, eco-effectiveness rather than just efficiency. That we actually have measures on our performance around environmental issues. And this is pretty apropos, because if we go back and start looking at the pollution ecosystem, we see a rich collection of chemicals being released by manufacturers. And you have depositional aspects within the atmosphere, and then you get downstream effects. You get acid rain, you get dead rivers, you get all of things. And this is a very complex global environment. But if we put on our magic glasses, we see the same notion when we start looking into cyberspace. We see a whole host of different kinds of vulnerabilities that react different in the environment. Each of these have different severities. Each of these have different impacts when they're released. And if you look at the depositional impacts, you see all of these things that go on in the environment as a result of these vulnerabilities, whether it's weak defaults or weak crypto or cross-site scripting. You see a host of depositional aspects in terms of patching, endless assessments, endless audits, all sorts of things going on and try to deal with this. And then, of course, you start seeing the effects of this. The acid rain of cyberspace are the botnets, are the malware, all the things that we start up seeing that get into our rivers and streams in the internet that result in cybercrime, that result in data breaches, all of those things. It is a, it is a causal element that but for these vulnerabilities, you would not see the same level of impact. Would there be no impact? No. If we made perfect software, you'd still see attackers out there. But we create this pollutive mechanism that creates further chemical reactions in the environment, which of course creates this cascading devastation of our digital ecosystem. Which of course, I don't need to preach to this choir, you know the numbers. Okay? In terms of smog and pollution, the cyberspace is just full of it, right? So, if we take this road to the sustainable enterprise and switch it, we see maybe, just maybe, a road to sustainable security in our lifetime. And what it looks like is this. We've got our age of pollution denial. The age of pollution denial still extends really into this age right now, is that there's really no such thing as perfect software. Hey, if you want software, you're gonna have to expect some defects. Pollution is inevitable. Software defects are inevitable. It's the same notion of inevitability that we have. That, hey, if you want this huge, big digital economy, you're going to have to deal with our crap, basically. Then we see here the end-of-pipe regulation age, which we're still kind of in. It's all the mandatory firewalls, mandatory anti-malware. It's this whole notion that you get end-of-pipe regulations, that we prescribe specific treatment technologies regardless of efficiency or cost effectiveness. And then you see kind of what's happening now is this whole notion, the greening of the software industry, where companies are actually stepping forward and trying to reduce their emissions. What does this age look like? Well, we'll get into that. All right, so we're here somewhere. Somewhere in all of this mess, we're here. We still have the legacy of this notion that there's no such thing as perfect software, just as there's no such thing as manufacturing without pollution. You're going to get some pollution, but as a society, we've made the choice. We pay a premium in the United States not to have smog-filled skies. We pay it for a premium in the gas, in the cars, in our home energy bills. You are taxed out the wazoo. You just don't see it. But you pay an enormous premium to live here in the United States as opposed to maybe Beijing. Okay, different pricing model, it's all transparent, but you're paying nonetheless. Okay, so this age of pollution is still here, but for the most part, I'm gonna say we're kind of here. We see a lot of end-of-pipe regulation like PCI DSS, we see a lot of SOX, data breach laws, and et cetera. But then we see some companies that are forward-looking. So we really are in this end-of-pipe regulation on the one hand. We have PCI DSS, we have SOX, we have data breach laws, and they all prescribe specific treatments with real no notion of efficiency or cost effectiveness whatsoever. We just tell people, well, this is what you need to do for good security hygiene. And you wonder why people try to avoid the expenditure, because it's prescriptive. And of course, what do businesses do? They see all the spend on security compliance as a drain on company performance. And what do? Well, private industry becomes, once again, reactive. They really get involved in legal compliance issues where they're really just trying to look to get the minimum compliance mechanisms to dodge any fines that might come up. Okay? Now, what's crazy about this in this age is that these prescriptive technologies aren't really focused on the manufacturers, but on the end users. That we're really regulating a bunch of end users doing nothing for the source of pollution whatsoever. And from a public policy perspective, that's just perverse. Now, we really are, on the other hand, though, on the threshold of opportunity, because companies like Microsoft, Adobe, Firefox, EMC, you take your pick. A lot of companies out there now are trying to reduce their emissions. Okay? And this is really the greening of the software industry, where we start seeing terms like building security in, or we have product stewardship in the form of SSDL or SDL or secure SDLC, or whichever word we actually decide on at some point. Okay? You start seeing the greening of American software, where we start trying to produce or emit less vulnerabilities into the environment and the ecosystem of the internet. So when we look at this whole thing, we go back and we say, okay, well, this is good. We see these companies trying to make some efforts here, and that's nice. Okay, the same thing with DuPont and 3M. They're making good efforts. We still see a whole host of other manufacturers out there which can basically ignore the amount of pollution they produce. And the emergent software manufacturers can undersupply security and oversupply vulnerabilities all they want because the market does a vote against them. And that has devastating effects for US cybersecurity policy. All right? So when we start looking at the whole sustainability issue, what does sustainability look like for security? What might sustainable security look like? I have no idea quite yet because we're not there. But it might be things like clean software or maybe even rugged software, but it just doesn't fit into the whole notion of anti-pollution, right? Or we could have security effectiveness. That is where we actually know what we're spending on, as opposed to just spending blindly and hoping that whatever we spend on reduces our risk to the point that we don't get our asses sued off. All right, and ultimately, maybe this whole notion of the base of the pyramid will kick in to not only the software industry, but to the security industry. Because if you look at the world, if it were only comprised of 100 people, only 7 of those people really have access to computer systems. The majority of the world does not. And this is ironic, because we call these people stupid. They're all first world users for the most part. And we call some of the most educated, smartest people that we have on Earth stupid. What about when the rest of the Earth gets online? Who haven't had education, who don't have the opportunity to even read, and we give them computer systems. If your smart user today can't figure out a certificate error now, God help that Indonesian farmer. Because he's not going to stand a chance against the type of cyber attacks we see now against first world computer users. So this whole notion, there is more money to be made in security and technology than ever before. But we're gonna lead these people to the slaughter if we don't give them systems that they can choose better with. All right, so these are some of the lessons that GE learned in part of their eco-imagination and their sustainability initiatives. One, they said, well, it'll probably cost too much. And what they learned was that it actually saved the company money. Two, it's really all about being green. But what they learned is it's really about industrialization, or put on your business hat, top line. It's all about growing revenues for the company. It's not just about saving money for the company. Customers will hate this, okay? They won't want to have a bunch of pop-up dialog boxes, whatever it is we might put in the security industry there, but they actually realize that customers will save money. They actually reduce the amount of taxation on them by not having to spend so much on other pollution control offset technologies. Here we have a big issue. They thought that action by the elite will be necessary, whereas opposed it was really about scale. It was really about creating new jobs that they never even thought about creating. Okay, we don't need an elite movement. They might need a vanguard kick things off, but if you rely on the elite, you'll only end up with frustration. And then finally, well, we can do this alone, which you still see in the software industry tremendously to many regards, when you realize that a system is required, not just a market, or not just a intercompany system, but a market system where you can differentiate between competitors. So there are possibly 10, those are the lessons that GE learned. I'm going to give you what I think are maybe some of the 10 lessons that we could learn very quickly about the whole pollution/software vulnerability issues. The first lesson is this: inevitability is a choice. Inevitability is a choice. That Pittsburgh in 1948, this shot was taken at noon because of all of the coal emissions from the plants. All right? Now, if you look at Pittsburgh in 2010, completely different. There is something that happens within the mind when you flip to say, like, wow, this is really prosperity. I can't breathe, but this is what prosperity must feel like. To, wait a minute, this is pollution. This is hurting me. This is killing us. When that switch happens, we're not quite certain yet. But there is a notion that people will choose prosperity, and they really don't care what it looks like at first. If you go to Beijing in 2008, that's the entrance to the Forbidden City. China is an emergent power, and they are willing to pollute aggressively in order to get there, just like we did. Okay? Moscow, 2010. It's in there. I kid you not. Red Square is somewhere in that picture. Okay? Emergent economies will pollute profusely in order to gain the prosperity that they've seen the United States gain. All right? So we see the same thing, though, if we apply this to the software industry. Namely, people are so focused on feature marketing that they do not stop to think about bugs until it is too late. After generations of this and of the problem getting worse all the time, end users have developed a sort of Stockholm syndrome with regard to buggy software. They believe it is normal, expected, and inescapable.